What's up, everybody? Thanks for stopping by. It's episode 19 of Stir Crazy, right here by the Real News Network, where we talk about the news cycle and things that are happening in and around our nation, in and around the globe, and things that matter to you. Of course, today is our special Earth Day edition. Happy Earth Day, everybody. We got a big conversation here in store for you. Coming up on today's show, we're going to be talking about how they are practically giving away gas because the price has fallen so much. So, where is that excess oil being stored? Probably nowhere nice. Also, is our new car minimalist norm going to remain that way? Many people aren't driving right now. Also, lots of cities, not just here in the US, but across the world, have closed miles of roadways, really so people can have more room for social distancing as they get outside. But the car is not really as important as it was just, say, several weeks ago. We're going to get into that. In addition, there has been some developments around the Flint water crisis. I'm not sure if you guys have heard this or not, but there was an astounding piece written by Vice, which reveals so much, including the fact that Michigan state officials knew in advance that switching Flint from the Detroit water system over to the Flint River would cause harm to citizens. When will Governor Rick Snyder, former governor of Michigan, be forced to pay the price? We're going to get into that as well. And there's just a whole lot going on. But before we get started, I really want to bring in today's very finely curated Earth Day panel. So starting off with our own climate reporter from The Real News, Steve Horn, joins us today from San Diego. We're also joined today by Dharna Noor. She is a staff writer at earther.com, former Real Newser here. And Anthony Rogers Wright, he's a policy coordinator at the Climate Justice Alliance. Welcome, gang. Thank y'all so much for joining us today.
Hi, y'all. Thank you, Kim.
Hey, Kim, what's good?
Awesome to be here with you guys.
Sweet. Gang, I was going to say Happy Earth Day, but then I looked at our first story, and it's about how there will be no polar ice by the year 2050. No more summer ice in the North Pole, gang. I mean, this is something that we get sort of regular updates about how much the ice has been dissipating from the poles, how we've seen record temperatures in the Arctic and in Antarctica. And Steve Horn, I know you've been following this pretty closely. So what is the latest, baddest news coming out of the North Pole?
Well, basically, the study that in question here is saying that even with pretty strong climate action, it is very unlikely that in the summers by 2050 that we will have ice in the Arctic, which is not only like I think like the stereotypical concern is, oh, like what about the polar bears? And that's sort of like was the image 25 years ago for people who cared about global warming. The real issue that I see is the issue of sea level rise that comes from that, and cities such as Miami, Florida, or cities all here on the West Coast, Los Angeles, all across the country, all around the world, Shanghai, all around the world that are at risk of going underwater if we do not take quick, radical action on climate change. And so I think that the summary of that is that we're already going to see very extreme repercussions from climate change. I don't like to even call it climate change. I like to say the climate has changed. And what are we going to do to not make it worse? But that's the news. That's sort of the summary of the news as I see it.
You know, Dharna, when we look at the status of the sea ice, Steve raises an excellent point. We're talking about sea level rise. And as we live here on the coast, Baltimore absolutely would be impacted by that, as would New York, as would Philadelphia, Miami, Charleston, South Carolina. A lot of these coastal cities are maybe not taking the precautions that they need to, given the science that keeps coming out. However, I mean, given the recent sort of evaporation of pollution that we've seen because of the COVID-19 pandemic global shutdowns, do you think we're going to continue on this track? Or are our leaders going to look skyward and say, hey, I'm breathing a little better. Maybe we should enact some policies that keep us more on this track?
I mean, I would like to think that this would be the opportunity for lots of changes that I think all of us would really like to see. Um, but it also, in a sense, it does make me nervous to think about this as like a potential good thing for the environment, because of course, like human beings are an important part of the environment. We're in an epoch called the Anthropocene. Like human beings are the things that are like changing the environment more than any other species. And I hate to think that the only possible way that we could lower carbon emissions in the way that we have been is by, having the global pandemic where like millions of people could die, and people are being forced to stay in their homes, and like the economy is crashing in ways that are really disproportionately hurting people who are already disproportionately hurting. So I hope it doesn't take that. And like the Arctic sea ice melting will impact not only coastal cities, but also there was this really incredible atlas that the McCarter Center at University of Pennsylvania released pretty recently that showed that the ways that the fallout from coastal cities getting overwhelmed with flooding could mean that there will be huge influxes of people moving into other places. So if everybody from Miami has to move further into the coast, that could really overwhelm like resources in the middle of the country too. It's really a problem for all of us. And like, it's also a problem for not only polar bears and like animals living near the North Pole and near the South Pole, but also indigenous folks who are living there too. Like there's people who are directly impacted by sea ice melting also.
Absolutely right. And people who are of color across the globe are disproportionately impacted as well. I'm thinking of all the island nations, are really around the world, that have long been ringing the bell that it is us who is feeling this sea ice melt before the rest of y'all. So pay close attention to it. Anthony, we're dealing with a global pandemic at the moment. And, there's been some science that shows that as the permafrost and everything thaws at the poles, we could be releasing some, ancient biological nastery upon ourselves. We don't seem to be taking steps that indicate that we are interested in our own self-preservation. So what could we be done now? What could we be doing at this moment?
Yeah, no, I think everything that Sister Darna said is spot on. The first thing that we have to do in this moment is just have the political will and the imagination. You hear even right now, the dominant narrative is we have to restart the economy. And I reject that. I say, why would we restart the economy when what we need to do is reshape it? We need to reshape the economy and use our imaginations and really visualize what a non-fossilized economy looks like. Sister Darna referred to it as an Anthropocene. I refer to it as a racial capitalocene because it's not just about the emissions, right? That's like a symptom of the climate crisis. The root causes is the white supremacy, the patriarchy, and the colonization. And if you don't think that, the massive genocide of indigenous people to Turtle Island and the theft of African people from a continent and bringing them over here isn't a cumulative impact to the overall climate crisis, you're not really paying attention. So, we really have to like dig in. What is climate change all about? It's about hypercapitalism. It's about white supremacy. It's about people who are deemed as dehumanized, right? So we're talking about polar bears, but Black, brown, indigenous folks aren't even seen as humans, which is why, we haven't seen the same level of urgency with COVID-19. It's killing Black and indigenous people disproportionately. And even climate change, as Sister Darna said, has always been disproportionately impacting Black, brown, indigenous, and poor white folk. Those people are seen as disposable, right? I mean, you even have some GOP lawmakers saying, sacrifice yourself for the economy. And I'm like, fuck that. Like, why would any Black person sacrifice themselves for this fucking country? Like, and that's no disrespect to the brave Black and brown sisters, brothers who put on the uniform. Like, do you, good for you. I get it. And I'm not trying to shame you. But this idea that people who are living in a state of apartheid should also be the people who sacrifice themselves to get out of a mess that they didn't create is a big problem. So I think that this Earth Day it's really more so than celebrating 50 years. It's understanding what we say at the Climate Justice Alliance is that the resistance has been since first contact, 500 years, not 50 years. And we have to shift the consciousness to things like that means letting go of this idea of being shocked, disrespect to certain authors, but this idea of a shock doctrine is bullshit. What are you shocked about at this point? Like Black, Brown, Indigenous people aren't shocked. This is the doctrine of the status quo that has been in existence for 500 years. We have to move on from ideas of like another world is possible and embrace this idea another world is happening. And that those happenings are coming from frontline communities in the form of just transition and energy democracy and food sovereignty. You see what incredible people like Colette Hinshaw Battle is doing with Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy in the Gulf Coast, first regional Green New Deal effort in the country. You see what frontline folk like Sylvia Chi and Mia Yoshitani from the Asian Pacific Environmental Network did to lead the passage of AB 857, public banking in California. And then everybody knows about the legendary Elizabeth Yampierre, the brother Eddie Bautista, Robert Gritz-Matzin and their groups, the Mighty Uprose Brooklyn, New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and Push Buffalo, who basically led the New York Renews Coalition that led to the passage of the Climate Community Protection Act, that is deemed by some as the most aggressive piece of climate policy in the country, if not the world. So let's start embracing another world is happening. We just got to scale up and scale out those indigenous frontline solutions that have been with us. Everyone's talking about Green New Deal, big up on Green New Deal. But in 1991, frontline communities gave the world the principles of environmental justice, which I would argue is more radical than even Green New Deal, because it's calling for things like fucking reparations and saying that is climate policy. Reparations is climate policy. Indigenous sovereignty and free, prior, and informed consent. So we got all the tools. What we need to do is just use them and not always like, we got to reject the false solutions like cap and trade and market-based solutions that mainstream environmentalists treat like a new Taylor Swift album with Gwen Stefani sitting in on a song. Like that's not what's like going to get us to where, Sister Dharna reports on and where we need to go. What's going to get us there is the frontline solutions, the indigenous wisdom, and it's going to be led by Black, Brown, and Indigenous women. So if you're not into feminism, sorry, you're going to be left behind and encompassed by the waves of justice, and you might drown. So, yeah.
What's his name, ladies and gentlemen? Ice Cold, Anthony Rogers Wright with the ice. And now we're going to go to some heat because we like to bring in our next guest this afternoon, Michael Mann. He is the director of the Earth System Science Center. He is joining us today. I'm going to speculate from parts unknown, Michael. I know you were down under for some time. I'm not sure if you're back stateside or not, but we'd like to welcome you to Stir Crazy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be with you. And I am back in the Northern Hemisphere here in central Pennsylvania, self-isolating in my basement right now. And looking forward to this conversation. If I know it was going to be a happy hour, I would have brought something to drink with me. But hey. I'm looking forward to us talking about where we are, where we are on this 50th anniversary of Earth Day. It's a critical juncture. We have already heard about the challenges that we face when it comes to the what is arguably the defining challenge of our time, the challenge to avert catastrophic climate change. We have lots of obstacles in our way, and yet I think there's reason on this 50th anniversary to be hopeful that we might be able to get on the path that we need to be. And we have a critical election coming up later this year where we have an opportunity to vote for candidates who will place the issue of climate change and issues of climate justice that we've been talking about here front and center and act on our behalf rather than the polluting interests who have for too long been able to buy out our political system with the unlimited campaign funding that they have used to put in place climate change deniers, industry lobbyists, and a president in Donald Trump, who is just an apologist for the fossil fuel industry, and plutocrats who are currently dismantling the 50 years of environmental achievement that we saw remarkably under some Republican as well as Democratic administrations. We're even seeing Republican environmental policies now eradicated under the current administration, and we can't withstand another 4 years of this. And so looking forward to November, we've got a golden opportunity here to get on the path that we need to be. And frankly, this crisis, this pandemic that we have been suffering through, it's a tragedy, and yet sometimes out of tragedy comes opportunity. We have an opportunity to try to remake this economy and our society in a much more sustainable fashion, and to use this as an opportunity to rethink our priorities as we move forward.
You know, Michael, I wanted to get your observations because this past winter, you were down in Australia and you were witnessing firsthand what many of us here were watching on television, those record historic bushfires that burned millions of acres of outback and even in proximity to some of the urban areas as well in Australia. I wanted to get your take on some of the factors that culminated to this tremendous, natural wildfire event, but also, how it impacted people of color in Australia. How were the Aboriginal people impacted by this? Because we know that even with, natural weather emergencies or disasters, it is brown and black people who tend to bear the brunt of that the hardest. So tell us what you witnessed in Australia this past winter.
Yeah, so I mean, it was literally, it was almost difficult to comprehend, because as a scientist, I study the impacts of climate change on a daily basis. I look at model output. I, do research into the impacts that climate change is having on extreme weather events. And yet it's something very different when you are literally on the front lines of witnessing the impacts of climate change playing out in real time. And that's what we saw in Australia. We've seen it here in the US in the form of unprecedented, wildfires out west, floods, superstorms, heat waves, droughts, that undoubtedly have the fingerprint of human-caused climate change in them. We are now witnessing in real time the devastating impacts of climate change. But down under, in Australia, it was perhaps the most breathtaking example that I have ever encountered of, again, literally witnessing climate change playing out in real time. And as I like to say, this isn't rocket science, okay? You take unprecedented heat, which they were seeing, unprecedented drought, both of which have been caused by climate change, and you have the recipe, the ingredients for massive wildfires, bushfires, as they're called down there. And they've never seen anything like this before. Now, it's interesting, you mentioned the First Nations peoples of Australia. They, of course, as we see frontline communities, those with the least resources, those most marginalized, suffer the gravest consequences of climate change. They have the least resources, the least resilience to deal with the impacts. And that's certainly the case down in Australia, as it is in the United States and everywhere else that is dealing with the impacts of climate change. But what's also interesting is that the native people of Australia actually have some deep insights, tens of thousands of year-old insights into how to live sustainably in this very challenging terrain. I mean, Australia, if you were going to choose the worst possible continent for human habitation, it would be Australia, centered in the subtropics where it's hot and it's dry. And of course, climate change is exacerbating those things. And yet the native people, the First Nations people of Australia, have learned lessons into how to how to manage the land, how to engage in controlled burning in a way that is sustainable. And frankly, many of the folks that I met down there, the First Nations folks that I talked to, said that it was frustrating to them that the government, this is the conservative Scott Morrison government, which is as bad on climate as the Trump administration is here in the United States. It's sort of their counterpart to Donald Trump. Their government has been unwilling to actually heed the wisdom, and engage the First Nations people, who have some very important lessons as to how to deal with this unprecedented threat that Australia is dealing with, and frankly, that we're dealing with now everywhere. Look at Australia, because that's where the rest of the world will be soon enough if we don't act now.
Steve, did you have a question for Michael?
Yeah, Michael, I have a question for you about the parallels really between this is something that you've talked about for decades in your scholarship, but the notion of we need to flatten the curve on climate change, like the historical curve of the hockey stick is what you're known for climate change, and now so the curve is back in vogue when we're talking about coronavirus today, and it's gotten popular uptake at first. But what's interesting to me is in the same group of people, we'll say the same political sphere that attacked the hockey stick is now attacking the model around
Remarkable, isn't it?
COVID-19.
Yeah.
It is. So what do you think about, like, I guess, like, do you think there can be any uptake of this notion going back to climate of flattening the curve since it was so popular with COVID among some people? And what do you think of the dynamics?
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating juncture that we're at, where we're laid bare now is the real cost that can be measured daily in human lives of science denial and of industry motivated anti-science that serves the same agenda, right? In the case of climate change, the powerful fossil fuel interests who run the Trump administration, of course, would like to see us stay addicted to fossil fuels. They're profiting, or they have been until this latest crisis, have been seeing record profits resulting from our addiction to the burning of fossil fuels, which is, of course, destroying our planetary environment. It's really the same thing here. If we act on this crisis, that we know there will be some repercussions for powerful corporations that will see lost profits. And Donald Trump, of course, fears that his presidency will be threatened. His reelection chances will be threatened if the lockdown continues. And of course, those same special interests, the fossil fuel interests and the other corporate interests that run the current administration, want to keep Trump in power so that they can continue advancing their deregulatory agenda, which has been marching forward even as we deal with this crisis. We have seen the further eradication of clean air and clean water restrictions and carbon emissions restrictions. And so they want to keep that power. They know that the only prospect that they probably have for maintaining power is to reopen the economy at the expense of human lives. And as we heard earlier, especially frontline communities, the most marginalized people are the ones who, again, have least access to health care, are in communities where they don't have the sort of access to medical assistance that well-to-do people have. So, once again, what we're seeing literally, and it's laid bare because with climate change, it's a little bit more subtle. It's playing out more slowly. The lost lives are real, but they're not as visible. Here, we're seeing the actual cost, the toll measured in lost human lives of an agenda that favors economic wealth for a small number of powerful corporations and shareholders at the expense of the lives of everyone else.
Hey, Brother Michael, this is Anthony. First of all, thank you so much for your corpus of work, man. It's super important, and I'm a big fan. I did want to ask though.
For your work, by the way.
Yeah, thank you, brother. What can the science community do, and what can we do to organize the science community even more on this issue of frontline folk being the first, getting hit first and worst, killed first and worst as well? Because Black and brown people definitely believe in science, for sure, and I'm wondering how to make all your incredible research, accessible to these folks, and therefore, as a tool to really mobilize people, right? I'm sure you saw the report that came out of Harvard about a week ago about like a slight rise in PM 2.5 increases potential mortality to COVID-19, and I'm just wondering how to make your amazing research more mainstream, more accessible, and more of a weapon, quite frankly, because we need to go on offense with this now.
Thanks. I'm with you very much. And thanks for those comments. I think, the science is important, right? And the science is under attack, just, with climate change as with the coronavirus, because it's a threat to the powerful special interests that we're talking about. They have in part been able to stymie action by confusing a large cross-section of the public. convincing the public that the scientific evidence isn't there, that they can't trust where we heard this before, we can't trust the models. These are alarmist predictions. That's what they said about climate change. It's what they're saying about COVID-19, even as we're watching friends and family members and loved ones perish from this deadly pandemic. So we've got to make sure that, in this war over facts, that science and reason win out. And that's part of, my messaging is to try to make sure that we get the actual science out to people. But, I'm in this ivory tower. I'm an academic, a scientist. There is no one messenger who's ideally suited to this task of communicating the science and its implications to the public. We need a variety of messengers who have, who have credibility in different communities, people from the faith community, people from the environmental justice community, people from the scientific community, people from the world of politics and economics, health, the health profession, people of faith. We need everybody out there communicating the science, not just the science, not so much the science, but the impacts and the risks and the damage that we are seeing because of climate inaction, so that we mobilize the sort of public support that we will need. Even if the Democrats win the presidency and both houses of Congress, we are going to see those same vested interests, fossil fuel interests, marshal the resources that they have, literally billions of dollars, to fight tooth and nail any effort to advance climate policy and to advance environmental justice at the same time. And so we're going to need to mobilize the people to be there, the ground forces that our policymakers will need if they are going to advance this agenda in the face of massive, well-financed opposition. We saw it with healthcare. We saw it with climate policy under the Obama administration. And I actually think that Obama accomplished quite a bit given the remarkable forces he was up against when it comes to climate action. But to make progress here, we are going to need to provide the ground forces necessary to allow our elected representatives to advance the cause of climate action and environmental justice.
So, Michael, 50 years on from the first Earth Day, I'd like to know what your opinions are about the status of the climate justice movement, how it has evolved from the 70s, 80s, 90s into the 21st century, and whether or not we are still doing enough. I know we are facing, tremendous obstacles, both natural and human, right, from both man and planet.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this is about survival ultimately, and whether or not there will be additional generations of the human race going forward if we aren't unable to sustain Earth as it is and improve it as we go along. So how do you feel Earth Day has evolved for better or for worse since its inception?
Yeah, well, I think it continues to be a very important sort of opportunity to have a conversation that we ought to be having every day, right? Every day should be Earth Day. That's the irony here. The idea that we would take one day a year to focus on what maintains our planetary existence, a healthy environment, a healthy planet. The idea that we would only choose, one day a year to sort of focus on that speaks to the problem here, which is that environmental sustainability is not as front and center as and issues of climate and environmental justice are not as front and center as they need to be. And we're having an interesting conversation right now on this 50th anniversary of Earth Day. I think there's an opportunity now that we haven't had before, which is in the wake of this epidemic, this pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic. we've sort of collectively taken stock. We've been afforded an opportunity to reflect a little bit on, our planetary existence and an extraction and resource-based economy, and questions about whether this is sustainable. Can we continue on this extractive, resource-based economic path and maintain, and sustain our planetary environment? And we're starting to have some questions that have arisen when we've been able to witness the profound impact that we can have when we suddenly change our way of doing things, and we use less resources, we engage in less transportation, less use of fossil fuels. We've seen how powerful that is. And we can start to imagine that, hey, if we can take the collective power that we have as individuals and combine that with politicians who might actually be willing to advance our agenda rather than the agenda of polluters, it allows us to start to speculate that, hey, maybe we can change this path. Maybe we can find a more sustainable path forward where we can meet the basic resources and in a just way, and in a way that allows everybody to benefit while still preserving, the health of our planetary environment. Because look, if you don't have a livable planet, you don't have an economy. That's something we have to remember. We talk about, the stock market every day. Every day is stock market day. We only have one day where we really focus on the environment. And yet without a livable environment, there's no stock market, there's no economy, there's no human civilization. We have to remember that every day.
Mm. Wise words from Michael Mann. He's the director of the Earth Systems Science Center. Michael, this was a real treat to have you stop by Stir Crazy on our Earth Day celebration. So thank you so much for making the time. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Next time I will show up with a beer in hand and we'll do this again. All right. Thanks, folks. Enjoyed it.
Take care, man. We appreciate it. Wow, gang. So great questions from the panel there. I appreciate that. But, Michael raises great points, obviously, that we are in the fight of our lives. Without a sustainable planet, there's not a sustainable anything else, is there? And I want you to imagine, how inconvenient this coronavirus pandemic has been, if you're fortunate enough to just merely be inconvenienced by it, right? There are lots of people who are out here suffering tremendously. But I just want you to imagine, not being able to drink the water out the faucet, or not being able to wash your hands, or not being able to hop in the shower, right? Imagine not being able to do that for a day. What about not being able to take a shower for a week? What about a month? What about 6 fucking years, okay? It has been 6 years since the Flint water crisis occurred. Back in 2014, the city of Flint, which is a town in Michigan, I think we all are familiar, town of about 100,000, majority Black city, low income city, their emergency manager decided, and the governor and some other people as well, decided to make the switch from the Detroit River system, not the Detroit River, but the Detroit Public Water System, which gets their water from Lake Huron, and decided to switch to the Flint River, which is tremendously polluted. And it turns out in this really explosive report by Vice News that elected officials as high as the governor of Michigan at the time, Governor Rick Snyder, knew, they were informed that if this change was made, that microbial elements would increase in Flint residents' water, that there would be higher chances of disease, which did happen. They had a Legionella breakout in Flint after this water switch occurred, and dozens of people died. There has been tremendous amount of ongoing impact since Flint was in the headlines, folks. And I just want you to know that just because something is not in the news on a daily, weekly, or even monthly basis doesn't mean that the shit still ain't happening, okay? So the people in Flint, Michigan are still suffering. This is a climate justice issue. Anthony, I want you to tell us about how important that it is that, for one, that this could only happen to a mostly Black city in the United States. Not only, but I know indigenous communities are dealing with this shit too. But the fact that it was Black folks is the reason why it was been allowed to persist for more than half a decade.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you, Sister Kim, for also bringing up the plight of indigenous folk with water, because, we heard a lot about Flint, but, there were folk, the Dene tribe, Navajo people who have been exposed to toxic water from uranium mining for like years, decades before Flint, like where ordinary indigenous women were bringing in gallons of water once a week to certain tribes. But this is again, what I said earlier. This is all about the root causes. I mean, you cannot talk about Flint without talking about the racial disparities that have existed in this country for unchecked and unmitigated for far too long. And the cumulative impacts of that, right? I mean, you talk about COVID-19, not too far from Flint, Detroit was shutting off water for poor people at a time when you're telling people wash your hands, right? To fight COVID-19. People didn't have water. We just lost a 5-year-old fucking black girl, a 5-year-old black girl to COVID-19. Her zip code in Detroit has 600 people who have been infected by COVID-19. That is not a coincidence. That is not some outlier in a bell curve or whatnot. This is specifically dehumanization and white supremacy. A decision was made that these people did not need to have clean water for some reason, that it was okay to expose them to something so toxic that the EPA's maximum contaminant level, appropriate level for lead, is zero. We've taken it out of gasoline, but we've exposed people to it in their water. So, I'm not saying that it was necessarily deliberate, but the dehumanization was deliberate. We've seen differences in how environmental phenomena like hurricanes, and whatnot, the recovery is different depending on your community, which is why preeminent environmental scholars and practitioners, Dr. Beverly Wright, Dr. Robert Bullard, wrote their book, The Wrong Complexion for Protection. Very, very intentional. So, I mean, at the end of the day, this is about poisoned water. This is about shitty infrastructure. But as Bill Clinton might say, to paraphrase him, it's the white supremacy, stupid.
Dharna Noor, I know you did a tremendous amount of reporting on environmental injustice in Baltimore City. I know there are undoubtedly some parallels that you see between Baltimore and Flint and other communities of color disproportionately impacted by negligent policies that allow chemicals and other, pollutants to be disproportionately dispersed in Black and brown places.
Yeah, 100%. And I will say, there's no doubt at all that the disproportionate impact is going to be on folks of color. We're talking about the United States, that's true across the board. But there are plenty of white communities that are seeing just massive amounts of environmental pollution in their water too. Hoosick Falls in upstate New York, it's like a 98% white community or something like that. And it's been revealed that they had PFOA, I think one of these forever chemicals in their water for decades. And I think the real underlying issue in all of this is that it's not okay to prioritize profit when it comes to something that's a basic human need. Here in Baltimore, we were I think the first major city to ban water privatization, which was a huge just a huge boon to the environmental justice work going on here, because just time and time again, we've seen it in Flint, we've seen it in other communities. When a private entity comes in and takes over a water system, they're always going to make changes that are in favor of their shareholders, not in favor of actually promoting access to people. That means water bills go up. That means often contamination goes up. And, I think a lot of folks are really afraid now that because water, utilities, municipalities, stuff like that, are making less revenue from people using their water, businesses are shut down. You don't get all the water bills from businesses anymore, stuff like that. There's going to be a huge lack of, municipalities are going to look at that. They're going to say, we don't have the money right now to make a bunch of infrastructural changes. We don't have the money right now to make upgrades to our water system. Let me just give this to a private corporation and let them deal with it. And that could mean that a lot of people, and as y'all are saying, disproportionately Black folks, brown folks, and, across the board, in addition, poor folks, are going to be seeing the burdens of that. And, to think that the pandemic could usher in those kinds of changes is really scary.
Well, gang, like I said, I strongly recommend folks go to Vice and check out this very detailed and comprehensive story. But really, the hook is that it was ruled earlier this month that a federal judge ruled that Snyder would face a civil lawsuit from a Flint victim, and that's a big deal because there needs to be some sort of recourse for these people. You're talking about something that is going to affect people for generations. Ingesting lead and heavy metals and toxic materials in developing brains is obviously not good for folks. And to poison a city the size of Flint, it's a city of 100,000. I mean, we're talking about, the ripples of that really just stretch on. But I wanted to move along and shout out to Jordan Charlton and Jen Dice. They were the co-authors of that Vice piece. I wanted to move along to oil and gas, gang, because we're seeing something that we hadn't quite seen before. Not only has the price of oil gone negative, but Donald Trump is literally talking about bailing out oil and gas companies to an extent that we have not quite recognized before. Steve Horn, can you fill us in?
Well, there's a bunch of several dynamics going on here. Like there's the fact that the oil price is below zero. Like how does that happen? How could a commodity price be below zero? And there's a whole explanation behind that. But basically, the trading of oil is based on betting on futures and what the price might be in the future. And no one thought that in April 2020 that we would be facing a pandemic months ago when they were making those bets. And I think that's the whole point here is that I think that a lot of people in the environmental movement don't quite realize it, but the oil market is just like anything else. It's a commodity. It's speculated upon, traded upon, and that's why the price kind of goes up and down, besides the fact that it's based on production and selling and stuff like that. So that's a key thing, just an explanatory note. In terms of the political fallout of this was just fascinating. The fact that there's global negotiations ongoing with the Trump administration trying to convince Saudi Arabia, trying to convince Russia to slow down drilling because he thought that was the reason why the price was tanking, that they had basically put the gas pedal on pumping out more oil. Then that didn't work. So now we're at a point of he's weighing giving a bailout. He's given deregulation. Pretty much everything, every gift that he's trying to make has not worked. And now we're at the point that it's below zero. And it's kind of a question of what do we do next? And we're not at the point where he's actually given a bailout. There's a split between the industry, which I've written about. There's major oil companies like Exxon, BP, Shell, Chevron. They do not want this bailout to happen because they see it as all the other companies that are looking for it. They could go bankrupt, or worse, they could file for bankruptcy, or they could just go under liquidation. And I think that's what they think is going to happen. There's people are more familiar with bankruptcy. Liquidation means they don't even have enough revenue to kind of go through the bankruptcy process. They'll be liquidated. And I think Exxon, those kind of companies think they can sweep those up for pennies on the dollar. I think that's the future that we're going to see, is a consolidation of the industry from hundreds, if there might be over 1,000 companies, to a lot smaller of industry in terms of the number of companies, the companies that have more capital. I think that's where we're probably headed. And I think that, the companies that there's also going to be a lot of political favoritism in this as well. That'll be something to watch for those who are close to President Trump, like Harold Hamm, for example, the CEO of Continental Resources, is one to watch out for it. And of course, the major oil companies. Just be curious to see who they end up buying up and how this shakes out.
Dharna, we are experiencing what they call a glut of oil. So it seems like this oil is just piling up somewhere. Where is this oil being stored, and what is the cost? Not just in money terms, but other costs of this oil supply growing and not selling.
Yeah, that's a good question. And the places where you can put oil are filling up right now. Like refineries are filling up. I did a piece for Earther this week on the millions of dollars that are being spent on tanker ships, like these massive ships that hold millions of gallons of oil each. Traders in the industry are spending millions and millions of dollars just to put this oil somewhere, which is ridiculous. Like, we're spending all of this money to store this like shit that our world runs on that we know is deadly. And to Steve's point, like, you know, the price of, I'm tempted to be like, oh, yay, price of oil going down, whatever. Like, that's dope because fuck the oil industry. And that's like, I get that reaction from some people, but it scares me to think of A, like the effects that this is going to have on all the people who are working in the oil industry. And B, we're already seeing that the price of renewable energy, which sometimes when people talk about like transitioning to solar and wind and stuff, they'll say like, oh, it's cheaper to move to solar and wind, so the market is just going to go there anyway. But now we're seeing, okay, maybe it's not cheaper to go to oil or to go to solar and wind, and so maybe we don't have to transition. Maybe the market doesn't have to transition to renewable energy. And we all know who that's going to be good for and bad for. It's really time that you know, we have some real government action on mandating that we phase out of these deadly fuels.
You know, Anthony, I look at some of the industries that have, you know, lined up with their hands out after this pandemic has thrown the economy into disarray. And when I think about the oil and gas industry, and even if they are fixing their mouths to ask for federal taxpayer dollars, first of all, there was a good spate of time where y'all were making money hand over fist. So where are your reserves at? But secondly, how in the hell can y'all even ask for taxpayer dollars? Have you cleaned up the fucking Gulf of Mexico yet, you dickheads? Like, as much damage as this particular industry has caused, not only to the health of Americans, but to the land, air, and water, the fact that we're even entertaining giving them trillions or billions of dollars in relief because they've hit a slow or dry spell right now, it really grinds my gears, to put it mildly.
It's really interesting, though, because there's a lot of political dynamics going on. As we know, about a week and a half ago, the Big Seven, Exxon, Phillips 66, BP, met with the president and told him, like, in no uncertain terms, do not give us a bailout. We don't want a bailout. I called it a capitalism on capitalism hate crime because they didn't care about the smaller oil and gas companies, or who are the ones who are in real trouble, who are already laying off workers, who, you know, as was pointed out, their stocks are worth like less than a hot dog right now. So it's weird. The bigger oil and gas companies do not want these folks to get bailed out so that they can go in and sweep them up and conglomerate them. Then, on the other hand, we're also hearing about this plan from the four big banks, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, and Bank of America, who are actually thinking about owning and operating these companies because they see them as such a bargain. They have this like a spectacular belief that oil prices are just going to rebound somehow. It's just going to happen, and this is going to be a good, sound investment. Then today, and I still have to, like, you know, make sure that I'm not having an LSD flashback from 18 years ago, the president of the United States, Donald Trump, signaled that we might have public ownership over these troubled oil and gas companies, okay? Kind of similar to what Trudeau did in Canada with the purchasing of a pipeline for the Canadian people, but literally signaling that in order to bail these troubled oil and gas companies out, that would come with the condition of public ownership. This is the Republican president of the United States. So there's all these interesting dynamics going on right now. But no, of course, I mean, overall, on the one hand, while I do agree that like this idea of public ownership is very interesting and intriguing because then we take them and we transform them. But in no uncertain terms should we be using the people's money to bail these people out. And even if we were going to be using the people's money, then public ownership does seem like a pretty good idea. We're not essentially going to keep paying for our destruction. Like we are literally in the, I think it's like, according to Oil Change International, amazing group that provides incredible information and reports, $25 to $30 billion a year in subsidies. So we're basically paying to kill ourselves. We're paying to poison our people, our air, our land, and our water. That cannot happen again. And I don't think that even the Democrats, like the worst Democrats, are crazy enough to let that happen. They understand that the people are not going to put up with a 2008 2.0 scenario that will bring us right back here, probably in less time, right? This time it took 10 years. Maybe the next time it takes 5 years. you know, the inner capitalist in me is saying, like, let them die, let those oil companies die, right? You believe in free markets. It can't be capitalism on the way up and socialism on the way down. But my biggest concern right now are those fossil fuel workers. We have to make sure that we have their backs, that we take care of them, and we put them on the trajectory to the just transition where their pensions are taken care of, their health care is taken care of, their training to new jobs is paid for, everything and anything that they need. They did not sign up for this. They just are trying to put food on the table. They should not have to make a choice between their health and providing for their families. I stand with them and all of the workers. So this is a real important time for the environmental community to not just be shitting on the oil and gas industry, but also thinking about those workers. We need to take care of those workers as much as healthcare workers, as much as farm workers, as much as sanitation workers. That's what it's come to. But under no circumstance, they should not be getting us our money. What I will also say is I find it really fucking funny that we can like write $2 trillion checks, but when you talk about reparations, people always ask, how are we going to pay for it? Just throwing that out there.
Hey, we have a comment from the YouTubes. Zach Sherman says, voting for Biden does nothing for structural problems that are making 70% of people's lives very tenuous at best. I feel like regardless of what happens, we are fucked. Zach, we are fucked. You are 100% correct, sir. But we are trying to fight against being wholly fucked. We're going to try to, minimize the fucking as best as we can. So, guys, the globe has been on lockdown. We've seen a tremendous diminished use of cars and automobiles, and the air has responded accordingly. We've seen lots of precipitous drops of nitrous dioxide in the air, which is, a form of air pollution, something that definitely does not be good for humans to breathe in. Yes, I said does not be good. You heard me. I said it again. I said what I said. But are we going to keep this up? In the wake of us reopening the economy and everyone coming out of quarantine and isolation, are we going to keep up this minimalist use of cars? Because there has been really a noticeable difference in traffic, in air quality, in a lot of different ways. Steve, what are your thoughts? You live in California, which you kind of need a car in California, but how have Californians responded to their lockdown in terms of getting around?
Well, it's like anywhere else. You can't. I think people are still driving a little bit when they have to, but there's tremendously less amount of cars on the road. But I think that the bigger paradigm here at play is the apparatus that we've built over the past century, really, dating back to, we'll call it Fordism, the Model T car. And I want to point to the history because it informs the present. So the history is, of course, we completely remade society to allow for auto transportation. We remade housing. We remade everything. We remade zoning laws across the country. That zoning also contributed purposefully to segregation. And there's books about that and articles about that. That was part of it, the suburbanization. But what I think that's important is that whole legal apparatus was built kind of slowly but surely over time. That is the legal apparatus that almost makes it impossible right now, unless that's undone, like city by city, locality by locality, chipping away at undoing that. Like, for example, and there's a really good article about this that ran last year, but I think it's really relevant. And this is also like a conversation I don't feel like is necessarily like a focus that much of the U.S. environmental movement, which focuses a lot more on energy consumption and going into electric vehicles and stuff like that. What the article points out is we really need to kind of look back at that era to inform what we do today. And yeah, the article is called "Americans Shouldn't Have to Drive, but the Law Insists on It." It's by a law professor. And I think that these are kind of things we have to start thinking about. There's like an in-depth apparatus. We talk about just one example from his article that I thought was fascinating, because a premise of his article is, we talked about this on the show last time I was on, I believe, that people do die often in car accidents. There's 40,000 deaths from car accidents per year. There's 4 million serious injuries. So driving is very dangerous in the United States. Yet, like, unlike other things, like if you were to kill someone in other things, there's a certain crime, but there's actually its own crime if you kill someone in a car. It's called vehicular manslaughter. That's just one example. Another example would be the way that speed, or what do you call it, speed limits are set up is that the federal government, for 85% of, they assume that only 85% of people will follow that law. So there's just like all these kinds of like carve outs in the law that make it beneficial to own a car and to have to own a car as opposed to not owning one. And yeah, California is the perfect example. Like there's in this city, there's hardly any convenient public transit in San Diego that could get you around in a way that wouldn't take 3 times as long as having a car, if not more. So yeah, there are serious things that we have to kind of think about coming out of this. Like we've seen the benefits, but we don't at all have the infrastructure in this country or the legal apparatus to make it happen. And so I think it's important to look at the past of how this happened.
Hey, gang, unfortunately, we're running out of time. And, just to piggyback on a point that you said there, Steve, that, public transit is not necessarily accessible where you live. But we know that the highway system was built deliberately to destroy Black communities in urban areas. So really, the fact that we have to have a car to go places absolutely has its roots in racism as well. But before we get out of here for today, we are celebrating Earth Day, guys. Earth Day is a real thing. It was birthed in the 70s, sprung out of the environmental movements of the 60s and whatnot. But Steve Horn, there was a bipartisan legacy that brought Earth Day to fruition. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, so you and I just worked on a story on this. We interviewed Tia Nelson, who is the daughter of the founder of Earth Day, not the only one who made it happen, but the guy who came up with the idea is Senator Gaylord Nelson, who was a Democratic senator from Wisconsin. And he saw all kinds of issues happening around him at that time and thought that we needed to have teach-ins around the earth, the environment. This is before climate change was really something that was talked about in the environmental movement. But yeah, lo and behold, there were 20 million people on the streets by the time the Earth Day came around. So it went way beyond teach-ins. And in this aftermath came basically what we consider modern environmental law and modern environmental regulations, like the creation of the EPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, which was signed into law by President Nixon and other Republicans. So that was because of a grassroots movement, but it also is a depiction of the fact that things have changed a lot politically since then. It would almost be hard to even consider a lot of Democrats signing on to the things that Republicans were signing on to in the 70s for environmental protections. And it would be pretty much impossible to think of Republicans signing on to it today. So I think it really shows, since the 1970s, how far right the Overton window, if you will, has moved within our political system, which I think has also changed the Overton window in our political imagination of what we think is possible. I think that's how it ties into this whole thing with cars I just went over. It's like they reimagine an entire society based on the automobile. I think that it's time to start kind of unthinking that and thinking about different possibilities of how a society could or should be structured.
Well, let's hear from Senator Gaylord Nelson.
So my father's original call to action in 1970, 50 years ago, think about this, that call to action was one seen through this broader social justice lens that, frankly, the environmental community has only recently embraced. Better late than never. But my father's call to action 50 years ago was multi-generational, it was bipartisan, and it was a social justice lens through which he viewed the environment. And the environment wasn't just pristine places where affluent, white-skinned people could escape to enjoy nature. It included the environments in the inner city. It included public housing unworthy of its name. And I think it's certainly a failing on the part of the environmental community that it took us so long to hear that part of his message.
That was Tia Nelson, the daughter of the late senator from Wisconsin, Gaylord Nelson, one of the founders of Earth Day, or one of the people who helped bring it into legal existence through Congress. So, gang, that's our show, our Earth Day edition. I'd like to thank you all for hanging out. Thank everybody in the comments. Shout out to 206. Warrior Chief, I can't remember exactly your name. I saw your comment. Thank you very much. Steve Horn, Dharna Noor, Anthony Rogers Wright. Y'all brought the heat today on Earth Day. Thank y'all. We earth, wind, fire, and air today, folks. So thank you so much for coming by and offering up your brilliant insights. Okay. Well, I'll see y'all tomorrow. Take it easy, gang. Y'all have a good one. Thank you for watching the Real News Network.